Hello everyone, and welcome to our meeting with applied ethics and bioethics. Today we'll discuss a topic that is very dear to me and that I have been working on for about 20 years, which has always attracted my attention, and it is namely the virtualization of social space. The idea of virtual reality has gained ground only in the current period in the form of augmented reality, special glasses for virtual reality, and Second Life games, in which we have a meeting with another who does not have a physical projection, but is only a digital avatar, an incipient form of artificial intelligence, or even another player. There is already an abundance of movie about virtual reality, the best known being the Matrix series, which describe a post-apocalyptic world in which humanity in general withdrew from the part of artificial intelligence and hide it in underground shelters. Most of humanity remains a prisoner of artificial intelligence, being connected to a virtual global network without having access to what we call reality today. In essence, the virtual world is an alternative world to the one we live in and which involves the development of digital interaction with other entities that exist in the virtual space in the form of avatars, digital extension of real people, or completely digital characters without correspondence in the physical world. There are a number of contemporary cosmogonic theories which we would introduce in what we have called quantum metaphysics, which consider that the current world, the one we live in, would actually be a simulation in the sense described in the movie Matrix, created by aliens or other intelligent beings. Our world is nothing but a simulation, says Bostrom and others. The idea of virtual reality is closely linked to the idea of simulation, of transforming reality into something that seems to be real, but does not necessarily have a material consistency, an ontological consistency, if we want in philosophical terms. The idea of material consistency means that there is a substance associated with the information that we perceive. Referring again to the movie Matrix, we find that the hero is taught that the world he experiences in virtual reality, although it seems to have real consistency, it's actually just an appearance, a simulation of reality, and has no real substantiality. Basically, the difference between real and virtual world appear, according to the movie and science fiction literature, only in the nature of the substance from which the world is created. The substance we experience, our own consciousness seems to experience, is a real substance, while the substance of the virtual world is an ideal one. It is only information, but is perceived as real, as what we encounter in real life. Technological globalization can be analyzed from the perspective of the changes that occur in the interpretation of the social space, from the traditional one limited to geographical coordinates of the interaction to a delocalized and universalizing one. The digital revolution produced a phenomena of virtualization of social space, in the sense of transferring socializing interaction to virtual environments, with special and somewhat unpredictable consequences for the evolution of being and even the human species. Next, we consider the identification of some constitutive dimensions of phenomena of the virtualization of social space, of its evolutionary tendencies, and of the eventual sociopathologies. We will follow the interpretative drift of the terms reality and social interaction, respectively, in the sense of deconstructing the traditional anthropological perspective on the human being which we see as limited by our own corporality and proximity in the context of communication, globalizing, and generalization of teleaction. The cultural space, being essentially a cross-cultural, generates a continuous renegotiation of the interpretation of the social reality and of the construction of new interpretative models. Understanding the interpretative adrift of the concept of social reality in the context of communication, virtualization allowed us to say that the virtualization of social space has led humanity to explore a sui generis additional dimensions of space, noetic, experienced in the form of instantaneous communication and virtual ubiquity. By virtualizing the social space, we mean the construction of a new communicative universe in the virtual space and the transfer to it on social interaction with the globalizing charter. The globalization of communication, and especially of online, created a new features of social interaction, namely the escape from physical space into a purely communicative virtualizing reality. The virtualization of the social space modifies the behavioral habits and type of communicative interaction, can suffer virtualizing effects that lead to intrinsic changes of the interactional specificity by transforming the social space from a framework of interaction and coexistence into a framework of action, mediation, communication. There is a formalization of communication in order to be well positioned in the search engine in parallel with the decrease of the emotional impact of the act of communication due to its mediate character. The philosophy of mind questions the nature of mental reality and its substantial or informational character. Of course, a metaphysical problem is that of the reality of real substances, especially in the context in which, using quantum physics from a perspective of quantum metaphysics, we find that the substance we consider to be real is, at its quantum level, completely different from what we perceive, having a dual corpuscular and undulating nature, and not only a substantial nature as we perceive macroscopic reality. We understand the idea of virtual from the perspective of quantum metaphysics as a possible post-religious explanation of the experience of existence, namely that this reality in which we live is actually contained in the divine consciousness as a reflected reality, so as virtualized one. For Abhinavagupta, an 11th century Kashmirian philosopher, reality is nothing but a dream of the divine consciousness. Divinity hidden in the form of individual consciousness is recognized as divinity or awakens from the illusion of illusory dreams, thus become a divine consciousness that plays with itself or within itself, dreaming of myriads of worlds, names, and forms. Metaphorically speaking, we actually live in God's dreams. We are a dream in a dream, and therefore, in current terms, we could use the term virtualization for our entire existence. Beyond the mentioned metaphysical perspective, in social practice, we can identify more and more illusory interaction, observing that the social reality that we live as being constraining and immediate proves to be nothing but a social construction. Trying to define the idea of social construction, we can take as an example an object, let's say a table. We all agree it's for meal. It's a table to put there a meal. If I sit on it, then it becomes an object to sit on, namely a chair. What is a table? What is a chair? After all, we are talking about language conventions which change with the transformation of meaning. In this case, from the definition of the chair as a table on which we write, on which we take notes, put a computer is on to a chair on which we can sit, and there an interpretative adrift about the object occurs. By changing the meaning of a term or the definition with which we operate on that object or social construct, we generate an interpretative adrift. The interpretative adrift operated by our positioning on the table transformed the object in front of us from being a table into being a chair. If we manage to easily change the meaning of the terms that refer to immediately accessible material objects, applying an interpretative drift, changing their meaning, we ask ourselves what they are and how can we talk about more complex objects. Here we can ask the questions: from what height is a form of relief considered to be a mountain? It is often estimated that this comes from 700 meters, 1,000 meters, 1,050 and 1,500 meters, and so on, or more. The respective form of relief can be considered a mountain. We can give here an example: the movie The Englishman Who Climbed a Hill and Descended a Mountain in 1995, and which is an excellent cinematic example of the construction of reality. Those in the community where the main character lived consider themselves mountain people, a common feature among the inhabitants of Wales. Two representatives of the Geographical Society of London, who came to the respective community to measure the height of the relief form near to the respective locality, find that it does not fall within the specific dimension of a mountain. The landform lacked a few meters to be declared a mountain, so it is disqualified at hill level. Of course, it is the same form of relief, the same physical objects that the locals have been used for the centuries since the beginning of the community, but the social meanings that people gave were completely different. They knew each other, they had built an identity of a mountain people, of Mountaineans, and suddenly they were no longer Mountaineans. They could no longer consider themselves as mountain men. They were people from the hill, and as such they no longer recognizing their own identity because it no longer corresponds to the geographical truth that the Society of Geographers had arbitrarily established, namely the only form of certain height, a form of relief, is a mountain, and up to that height it is a hill, even if, traditionally speaking, the community identified itself as being from the mountains. In the community there is a very serious problem, identity, which its members fail to solve until this character appears, who came up with the idea of adding land elsewhere and thus increase by a few meters the top of the hills to reach at the height required for it to be declared a mountain. Then those in the community would have regained their status of mountains man, even if it means living on artificial mountain. The idea is to put into practice, and after a while it reach the desired height, so that the representative of Society of Geographers climbs a hill together with those who climbed the last amount of land and descended the mountains after declaring it as such. The mountain idea is a socially constructed one, either based on height or on the opinion of the community. Along with the first social construction, that of the mountain, there is also that of the inhabitants of the community who considers themselves mountain people, and status they temporarily lose and for whose recovery they fight. The mountain and mountain people construction is reified. It becomes substantial and defining. The metaphor of the substantialization of the mountain construct is captured in the movie precisely by adding material substance to that form of relief in order to become a mountain in their consciousness. A social construct, although it is the result of an interpretative convention, it is a pure noetical activity, acts constraining for the identity of the Mountaineans, as if their social status really depends on the substantial difference in height of the relief form. A social construct, once invested with interpretative power, objectifies and generates behavior specific to the new interpretative convention, as if it had always been real. Certainly, the height of the relief form did not generate the identity of a mountain of the members of the community, but its declassification among the mountains is an interpretative adrift, changed the identity status of the inhabitants, which was built from the perception that they lived near a mountain. In constructionist sociology, interpretative adrift is translated by expression words create worlds. Although the example of the movie seems hilarious at first sight, the constructionist sociologist considers that this is how we make sense of the reality in which we live. In fact, our personal reality depends on discursive context in which we interpret the reality. This is the first meaning of the most common of the idea of social construction of reality. It is a certain physical or mental object receives a series of definitions with which we agree at the level of group of people called interpretative community, who accept to use the same meaning for the same objects, that objects become a social construct. The idea of social construction of reality applies especially to symbolic objects such as values, standards, norms, professions, social phenomena, and so on. We speak of a social construction of normativity, of a social construction of institutions, of professions, of daily life in general, of the fact that we always have a process of allocating meaning to everything around us, be it objects from physical space, either objects from noetical space. When we talk about noetic objects, we are talking about emotions, feelings, values, worries, ideas, and so on. This is the first level of virtualization of social space that occurs based on the process of social construction of reality. Compared to the physical objective space, which is populated with substantial objects, the social space is one of our consciousness in which noetic objects appear, which do not necessarily have a material consistency, but a semantic one, but which influence our life. The first step in the virtualization of social space occurred when humanity began to talk about noetic products and introduce them into everyday life, whatever it is, money, laws, and so on. That is a Harari idea, and we take it on and continues to development this idea. Plato speaks of a world of ideas, which is a virtual one in the sense that it is not a substantial one, but a noetic. For Plato, however, the world of ideas is real. Moreover, it has a deeper level of reality than the material one. Why does Plato consider that the world of ideas has a higher level of reality? Because in order to assume our own reality, our idea must participate in the world of pure ideas, where the ontological substance of our world came from. Hence, the subjective idealism later developed in both Western philosophy and Eastern spirituality, and which is based on the belief that there is a world of ideas that is transubstantial, but to which we can access, in which we can participate. Aristotle speaks of a world of forms and substance, being the first to distinguish between substantiality and forms. We are acquainted with form rather than substance. Christianity introduced the idea of transubstantial world, or the kingdom of heaven, as a divine world which exists independent but not separate from our world. The world of Plato's ideas become the divine world of divine consciousness, in which the divine idea becomes the world of logos, which is understood as a person in Catholic theology, or hypostasis in the Orthodox one. The term person, from the Latin persona, literally means mask, that mask used by actor in Greek and Roman tragedy. The persona, the mask, was the one that the actor appropriated, put on his face when he said his role, then took off his mask, put on another mask, and could play another role. It is very interesting that the idea of divinity is related to ousia, to the unitary divine nature or to divine substance, speaking in Aristotelian terms, but also to the person, persona. We therefore have a divine unique consubstantial nature, without speaking of a created substantialism of a material substance, but of a divine essence, ousia, but also of a divine person, the form in which the divinity appears to itself and to the whole creation. Within this divine nature appears the three persons who are ultimately reunited in the idea of the Trinity, who are of the same nature but therefore as a person. Although originally the term persons came from the term mask, for instance non-existential identity, it was adapted to refer to the very ultimate reality of God's himself existence. The evolution of Christianity transferred the essentiality to these divine persons who are identified as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, distinct but indistinguishable existence of God. There is another interpretative adrift to the term person from non-essential form to uniqueness and inseparability of the divine substance. Christianity emphasized the idea of person, not only divine but also human, only the character of person being the one that ensured the individual access to divinity. Later, in current psychology, from the term person derives that of personality, which returns somewhat to the meaning of mask, which represents the social individual or in the relation to other. The term personality returns somewhat to this meaning of the mask in the sphere of psychopathology when speaking, for example, of multiple personality. I illustrate by the term person the idea of interpretative adrift, following the transformation that the original term persona, mask, has over time from the non-essential figure who hides the true identity to the hypostasis, a distinct form of the deity, inseparable from the divine nature, therefore an absolutely essential element for the divine being, both within the Trinity and before creation, and which represents even the mystery of the triune uniqueness of God. The interpretative adrift continues through the transmission from the divine to the human person, which acquires a series of specific features, personal attributes that are specific to it, and from here it slides towards the psychological outline, the idea of personality, and finally pathological personality. The term person used in different interpretative contexts, that of ancient tragedy, the Christian and later the psychological, acquires distinct contradictory meanings, but retain a certain interpretative invariance, namely the separation of individual from a common universal, of the characters to actor, of a hypostasis towards the ousia, respectively of the social personality towards the individual self. The interpretative covariance is the transition from non-essential to essential, depending on the essence-appearance game that the concept of person illustrates and goes through. The idea of interpretative adrift is particularly important for understanding the phenomena of virtualization of social space, because, in essence, this process is one of adding a noetic dimension to a real element, virtualization being a process by which a noetic object, including feelings, relationships, values, which are subjects of reflection, acquire a non-material and non-immediate value, and in addition there is an additional process of deconstruction and reconstruction of transition from the preoccupation to the essential to the preoccupation to the formal. Our postmodern society is an anecdotal one, in which the emphasis is on the packaging and not on the content, that is, on the form of non-essences. Moreover, the packaging often seems to refuse the content, thus generating a culture of exteriority. We consider that this phenomena is also one of virtualization, since the real identity, including that of individuals, is replaced by an approximate identity, a personality in the sense of a mask, and which only appears a person represents. Returning to the idea of person, the mask takes the place of both the character and the actor, the essence is appearance being confused. It derogates from the essentiality and deconstructs the idea of unique truth, pluralizing it in the multitude of particular truths valid in context. If we were to refer into the specifically religious terms mentioned above, the phenomena of virtualization preserves the person but eliminates the ousia, emphasizing in the difference from others or uniqueness, even caricature, without a bias towards the common human nature. The identity of a person without substance can be called avatar identity, an identity artificially created to survive in a world that is unsuitable for us. In fact, the process of deconstruction is incomplete as long as it is not followed by a reconstruction, by a return to the essential unity, only not a monolithical and externally imposed one, one in which to keep our identity in the network. This condition of the world as a simulacrum is emphasized on the model of electronic virtualization of reality, when we communicate in computer networks and then, due to the immediate electronic character in which our image appears to the other, we talk about simulacrum and simulation. The moment the mask overlaps with the essence, we have a simulation of reality. Objective natures means to the existence of material substantiality, while the subjective terms refers to an inner nature, intangible and immaterial, purely noetic but cognitively accessible, both in intellectual knowledge. With the advent of virtual and augmented reality, a process of virtualization of communication and social interaction in the form of computer-mediated teleaction is developing human-machine interaction that is another model of virtualization of human interactions. Descartes talked about two substances, one physical, specialized, res extensa, and other one noetic and spiritualized, res cogitans. The philosopher raised the issue of the communication of two substances in their mutual influences. The French philosopher's answer refers to a special corporeality of the pineal gland, which makes the connection between the two substances extensive and thoughtful. We return to the objects of today's discussions, namely the augmented reality in which we can experience in relation to the computer and now the smartphone and other smart environments, sensory experience of the noetic type, sensory experience that are not generated in physical immediacy. If I put a sensor headset, I see a 3D movie and I will have a full feeling that I am in that reality and I am riding the roller coaster, and I even have a stomachache, but all these sensations have no material support. In Cartesian's term, res cogitans acts completely independent of res extensa. The myth of the evil Cartesian genius, the spirit which deceives the intellect that there is an objective reality, can be caught as a creator of augmented reality. In the same sense of the confusion between reality and the dream, it is worth referring to the Chinese wisdom, to the sage Chuang-Tzu, who remembers that he dreams of a butterfly and on waking did not know who he really is. Chuang-Tzu dreaming that he is a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he is Chuang-Tzu. In the same way, the technological virtual reality is foreshadowed of a dreamlike type, which simulated reality to the point of creating confusion between plans. The insubstantial reality of a well-performed simulation should be indistinguishable from the sensory perceived reality. This would be a technological possible precisely because The cognitive process in our brain are virtualizing the sensory influences being used by the brain to simulate external reality. This process of mental simulation of reality takes place by eliminating redundant information from the senses, but also by anticipating elements that should appear in a sensory flow. This usually explains the phantom limb sensation that manifests itself in pain in the wooden leg. In the brain, there is a representation of a sensory of amputated limb, and when the mind anticipates the appearance of a sensory signal, a nerve signal from the limb generates the sensation, even if the sensory influx cannot occur, missing the corresponding organ and nerves. Precisely because of the mental construction of reality, we perceive augmented reality as substantial, as long as impulses are transmitted to the brain throughout our senses that suggest the reality and substantiality of an object. On the other hand, our brain, in the process of codifying the external reality as internal one, mental reconstruction, compares the sensation received from several receptors, which is approximated, and when this sensation are contradictory to each other or with the already memorized reality, the object of perceptions is declared illusory. In the dream state, the censorship of perceptual illusory is diminished, and the brain accepts the suggestion of the reality of dream image. Augmented reality is based on this process of perceptual reconstruction, the brain coming to accept that the Pokemon we hunt are real. We can touch them when, in addition to spatial glasses, the player has a sensory suit. Perceiving augmented reality as real, we attribute substantial qualities to it and try to build our reality taking into account the virtual reality. We practically start to expand our reality into a virtual sphere. This augmented reality is actually a model on which we can understand the process of virtualization, but in the fact we have been practicing augmented our own reality for some time. I'm currently speaking alone to a camera, but in my augmented reality, in my consciousness, I speak with you, even in a substantial reality. I'm alone in front of an electronic device for recording image and sound, a computer, and a touch screen. TV image appears on the screen, which has nothing to do with me, just as is the mirror image, although it represents me, that is not me. If I were a cat, I would try to paw to see if I could influence the image in the mirror, but as I'm not a cat, I learned that the image in the mirror does not have a substantial reality, which, although it resembles me, is not identical to me. Therefore, the entity in the mirror is a virtualization of mine. In the same way, we can virtualize any social interaction. Although I realize that I'm interacting with a camera, previous experience of information, reading the instruction to use the camera, assure me that through it I can interact with you, with a generic you, because I have no evidence if I communicate with one, with two, many, or zero people. Eventually, it is possible to talk to a camera alone, and this may be valid until the end, as there is no interaction with anyone if this transmission is not received by any person. This is the specificity of virtualization, of addressing another non-present, of accepting that non-presence or immediate non-present can still be personal and can generate interactions. This represents the introduction of a new dimension of space in the communication process. For us, spatiality is represented as immediate, as a place where I can manifest. In fact, through online communication, we introduce another essence of spatiality, from the immediate to the mediate but non-topological, which allows a certain form of virtual ubiquity. From an ethical perspective, the dimension of responsibility changes from the one towards the spatial and temporary contingent, the person next to you, the neighbor in ethical terms, to the responsibility towards non-presence, toward the ethical relationship with the not neighbor immediately. The virtualization of communications deny a defining element of the human condition, that of the face-to-face relation with otherness. Virtual space is non-three-dimensional. the topological distance being replaced by the intersubjective intensity of communication. This change affects the perception of spatiality in the categorical quality and can be understood as a transcendence of the human condition of being located in time and space. The category of spatiality limits the freedom of consciousness from the perspective of ubiquity perception. The virtualization of social space through the virtualization of social communications requires a different ethic of the relationship with the other, non-present, and as such we can speak of a responsibility toward non-present. I talk to you personally as if you were by my side, although I am aware that I am addressing to a non-presence. In my turn, for those of you who receive this message, I am a non-present because the moment you watch this video, I will most certainly do something else. This delayed interaction is not entirely new and is not dependent on virtualization messages over time being possible since the invention of writing. The postponement of communication is a sure sign of civilization, which has accompanied humanity throughout its history. The delayed interaction is a noetic one and as such represents a form of virtualization of the social space in the sense of desubstantializing the other. The other is virtual presence, insubstantial, but which acts communicatively. Mass communication throughout television has generalized what we call teleaction, hence the term telecommunications. With the advance of the internet, communicative teleaction expands, gives rise to a new dimension of space, characterized by immediate distance. This was already foreshadowed by telegraphy, telephony, and later television and radio. However, in this way of communication, the feeling of physical distance remained perceptible. The feeling of immediate communication and ubiquitous present is much less present than in the case of internet, especially now that we are talking about intelligent communication systems that simultaneously transmit calls, data, audio, video, text, and affect at least 2 sensory channels. In online communication, especially the current on the allow video conferencing, simultaneous data transmission, voice and image, in my mind is generated the idea that I participate in the immediacy of the noetic reality, which gives me the feeling of a virtual ubiquity and at the same time makes me to assign to the interlocutor a virtual substantiality in the form of a mask, a persona, in virtual person and avatar identity. These relationships, although they are under the sign of simulacrum and the technological artifact, create in me the feeling of an immediate relationship with a non-presence. We started to carry out activity throughout telework, and this has become widespread all over the planet. The courses are conducted online and there is educational interaction, even if the answers come from the different locations, simulating an ordinary group meeting, not locally spatiality. This virtual ubiquity generates the sensation of moving to another dimensions of space, a sensation that calls into questions distances. In our opinion, the increase in online interaction, especially in the pandemic period, when most significant social action takes place online, changed the nature of social interaction. For us, the virtualization represents overcoming an ontological obstacle for humanity, the deconstruction of immediacy, closeness, and the need for a contingent to be able to act. The socialization processes we went through built us as a local being, which emphasized its substantiality. We need immediacy to be able to act. We perceive the limitation in the possibility of acting on the basis of distance as a component of our human nature, finite, dependent on our own corporality. Suddenly, we are talking about body extensions, processes which are not integrated in our biological nature, but which once the development of biological processes begin to generate a symbolic non-biological corporality. The traditional anecdotal expression regarding wooden foot friction is losing its relevance as long as bionical prostheses can transmit decoding nerve impulses from the brain as coming from a bodily but non-biological food. The same can be said about the sensation coming from the virtual reality headset, or even from the sensory suit, which allow the training of pilots in simulation, or about the practice of operation through telemedicine. Although we have not yet built an avatar identity, we are beginning to add this fourth virtual dimension to our extended reality, as we have delocalized bodily sensation, and as we perceive virtual communication to smartphone or laptop as an extension of one's own corporality. This simulation of extended identity will develop in the coming years as the human-machine interface will be developed in the direction of extended neural connections. Thus, it will be more and more difficult for us to understanding the reality of simulation, and we will most likely reach a point where we speak of extended reality or augmented reality as the reality in which we live, as at this moment our reality is already extended by the inclusion of noetic objects such as reified values, religious beliefs, and so on. We will be able to gradually have other delocalized sensors, not only hearing and seeing as at this moment, but also tactile in the case of the sensory suite and the bionic prosthesis, and we will talk about sensory delocalization coupled with virtual ubiquity. We are practically talking about another perception of space which will give us an ontological freedom, a transcendence of limitation in spatiality, in the sense of delocalizing, and ubiquity in the capacity for action, in the sense of teleaction, and perhaps omnipotence over virtual objects. Contemporary society, as acknowledged society, is at the point where it moves from the use of knowledge in order to create goods and services to the emphasis of the production of knowledge itself. The production of noetic goods existing only in virtual networks generates added value accepted as such, even in the world that we consider real. Cryptocurrencies, exclusively digital goods, are gaining commercial value, and today we are witnessing the emergence of the first virtual currency of the states and the migration of the economy to such currencies. The social phenomena related to the globalization of mass communication impose a new social communicational construct, namely the spiritualization of the distance as a virtual replica of the phenomenon of spiritualization of the border. The phenomenon of virtualization of social space has a polycentric and unstructural character. There are as many virtualizing environments as communication projects are carried out at a given time. A non-local consciousness can be interpreted as transcending the limitation of spatiality into a continuum of being. Social space virtualization technology allow the emergence of an additional dimension, untraceable, but in which consciousness manifests itself throughout action. Use robotic arms in telemedicine using 3D printing technology, construction of an object based on simple consciousness design without a transforming human intervention on a raw material. Constructed reality can itself be objective for us, but we are talking about an objective reality which is populated by substantial objects, and then we are talking about a virtual reality in the proper sense as a computer simulation of reality, and the fact that we are practically suffer a change in the perception of spatiality in virtualizing interactions in computer-mediated interaction in the sense of virtual ubiquity. Next, we will try to analyze from a bioethical perspective some aspects of the possibility of virtualization of the social space, following the effects of the pandemic in the period when humanity suffered a contraction of freedom of movement, manifest most strongly in the form of self-isolation, more or less voluntary, when the transfer of interaction in the virtual space was imposed, which allow a greater freedom of action in the sense of wider addressability of message, but also a greater dependence of artifacts, and such an instrumentalization of communication to adapt to the online environment. Placing ourselves in a bioethical discourse, we began to analyze of the virtualization of the social space with the problem in the sphere of public health and the way in which healthcare can be virtualized in the context of pandemic and later in the post-pandemic society. The first such way to virtualize health care throughout telemedicine. Telemedicine includes a wide range of applications starting from simple communication, consultations with family doctors, with the attending physician, in which an anamnesis can take place, a classical type consultation, possibly a video interview between doctor and patient, which allows a general assessment of the state of health, a primary diagnosis, and possibly an emergence treatment, possibly to prescription of a specialized consultation. Telemedicine during this period also aims to issue online prescriptions and send them directly to pharmacies so that they can be processed and eventually distributed by express courier to the patients, thus limiting the physical interaction between the patient, doctor, and pharmacist, and so on. This virtual mediated interaction generally retains the characteristics of a classic consultation because it is a type one-to-one communication which can be reduced to a simple telephone call or can also include a communication via the internet. We believe that this first form of virtualization of medical activity, telemedicine, based on direct but remote communication between doctor and patient, will diversify and become permanent in the post-pandemic period because it has already become a habit to go online to the doctor. The formation of the habit of consulting the doctor online and conversely of the doctor to consult the patients online, at least in the case of chronic patients, whose health condition can be generally evaluated remotely, will be able to increase the volume of online consultation. This will contrast with the classical image of doctors meetings with the patient presents in the collective imagination, which represents the doctor in the presence of the stethoscope and thermometer, for example. Current technology allows wherein necessary remote temperature measurement. There are thermoscanners that allow temperature measurement and are used in airports, even in agri-food markets, and so on. Also, outside the temperature, the pulse and voltage can be measured digitally, and there are already applications on smartphones that do this, that measure other features. We are talking about smart bracelet that measure blood pressure, blood sugar level, and can be programmed for direct reporting to the attendant physicians. This form of telemedicine cannot in any case replace the meeting with the family doctor, but it is the form of that personally I think will be generalized, being approached by doctors and young patients, some of them being part of the generation of digital natives, who will probably prefer this type of interaction to the classic one. An element that attracts our attention and that deserves to be analyzed from a bioethical point of view is that with the generalization of this type of remote consultation and to use the device for measuring blood pressure, blood sugar, pulse, and so on, those data can be subsequently requested by public institutions who have already met projects aimed at measuring blood glucose level in people in quarantine and reporting to the authorities this level, which eliminated the confidentiality of the doctor-patient relationship and creates a risk of accumulation of medical data other than that necessary to eliminate public health risks. Access to medical data beyond the limit of confidentiality and the legitimate need for information in public health programs may lead to inappropriate use of them and to discriminatory decisions. For example, the maintenance of public health measures beyond the urgency of necessity for public health on the entry in the agri-food market justifies on public health grounds, create the precondition for discriminating against persons suffering from acute suffering other than coronavirus infections, but they refuse the right to buy the food they need because they have a fever and everything that comes from it. We consider that once the thermal scanners are installed, which have a rather high price, they will not be taken off use after the end of the pandemic danger. They are keeping being motivated also from public health reasons. A person with a febrile conditions can transmit an infection, not necessarily the one with coronavirus, and then such generalized measure will be justified that will restrict the freedom of movement of the population. This can beneficial in terms of identifying disease risk and preventing the development of disease, but individually and collectively. On the other hand, this measure can create grounds for discrimination associated with the exclusion of sick people, but who do not pose a danger to the public health from social life. Public health imperialism can prove unethical when rights of the freedoms are restricted in its name, disproportionate to the danger that the restrictive measure combats. From a bioethical point of view, a balance must be sought between the right to privacy and the public interest in health. Professor Vasile Sărăstoae talks about the tyranny of public health, which implies that in the name of public health and the public good may be imposed a series of restrictions, but provided that they are strictly limited in time and space and be adopted only in the condition in which they are substantially absolutely necessary, being correctly and completely explained to the population, which, even if it was not in a position to consent, was at least informed in a way and in terms that ensure the correct reception of message, the need for this practice. The generalization of telemedicine can create the condition for imposing a mandatory consultation at a certain time accessibly to the majority of the population, including persons belonging to various categories of vulnerable population, as long as the state will diversify the digital agenda for accessibility of telecommunications and internet service in all areas, and for anyone who wishes. The approach of telemedicine based on digital consultation and measurement of biological parameters through intelligent technology is associated with preventive medicine by creating the premises for measuring biological parameters and frequent population screening. Another component of the virtualization of social space, which refers to telemedicine, is impact of artificial intelligence in terms of health assessment. Monitoring the health of patients, especially chronic ones, based on artificial intelligence programs, with the possible notification of attending physicians regarding the situation in which certain biological and functional parameters are exceeded, can be beneficial in the care of chronic patients, such as the case of insulin-dependent diabetics, those with kidney failure, heart problems, or those suffering from Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on. The person's mobility or lack thereof can be measured automatically. Interaction with artificial intelligence is a form of virtualization of social space that will be increasingly accentuated in the coming period. At the beginning of this pandemic period, artificial intelligence was used to identify molecules that could be used in anti-COVID therapy, thus increasing the chance of obtaining therapies based on remedies and molecular already on the market. Takes in the medicine, it will be used from diagnosis when it will be able to process much faster the biological data of the person, in fact of a large number of people, including for the purpose of use large-scale screening to identification of therapies, customized or active molecules needed in the treatment of various diseases. From a bioethical perspective, before granting AI special access to data on our health situation and healthcare management, precise rules, as well as limitation on access to AI to diagnostic and treatment activity, and especially to offer a level of autonomy to these softwares in the interpretation of patient data and in the proposal of therapeutical solutions could be taken. The development of medicine can only be based on the cooperation between the human factor and artificial intelligence, and I think this will become widespread in the post-pandemic period because there seems to be a positive experience related to doctor-patient interaction and the use of AI for both diagnostic and therapeutic purpose. We will talk about telemedicine, especially in an area where access to health services is difficult and where there are health inequalities related to this problem, both due to the distance from healthcare centers and difficult access to mobile health services, including rescue services, in certain locations such as mountainous areas. There are also a number of risks that we see in this process of virtualization, namely an increase in the level of medicalization of social life that will lead to an increasing dependence on medical, human or electronic consultation, but at the same time we will be less and less autonomous in their own health decision. Another area in which following this pandemic, the degree of virtualization has already increased is that of education. Educational software has been a constant and current present in our lives for some time. Distance and internet education is already a constant concern of most higher education institutions, and we currently have universities that operate mainly in the online environment. The best known platform for conducting online courses is Moodle, which is open source and allows free access both from the developers of educational program and from the beneficiaries, and as such the migration to the virtual was not an unexpected one. However, the migration of educational to virtual during this period was disturbing both for students and children, pupils, students, but especially for teachers. Why disturbing? Because you are suddenly put in a situation to rethink your subject as a teacher. You have to rethink your teaching methods in order to adapt them to another types of interaction different from face-to-face interaction. This migration to virtual has taken both teachers and students by surprise, and last but not least, educational institutions. First of all, there is the issue of internet access. When the Minister of Education and Research asked the entire education system to operate online, it is ignored a significant number of students and teachers who either do not have access to technology or do not have the digital skills to do so. Forced and accelerated virtualization of educational generate inequalities, especially when discussing the online conduct of assessments, including those of special value such as licenses, dissertation, and so on. Students and pupils in an urban and largely rural area also have access to the internet at this time through our computers, laptop, or smartphone, and it is considered that there are few people who would not have such devices, and therefore the decision to the Minister of Education is for schools to lead computers to students' parents. Even if internet access is resolved, there are localities that are not covered by 3G, 4G or 5G networks and do not have internet access, or 5G coverage is limited and does not allow the broadband internet interactions required for online courses with bidirectional video and audio sequences. Broadband internet raises issues related to information security, data transmission security, and even local data security. Another aspect is digital skills among both teachers and students. If we are talking more about digital natives among students, a series of difficulties arise among teachers who are suddenly put in the situation of carrying out activity for which they do not have skills at this time, especially in the case of those past a certain age and who have not assumed sufficient technological training to cope autonomously with the development of virtual courses. If most teachers were able to teach distance by email and were able to keep in touch with the students with the ministerial order that imposed the obligation of online education, they feel put in the front of the needs to communicate daily with the students and feel overwhelmed by the situation, which creates a state of discomfort for them, especially when they receive humiliating remarks from students whose digital skills far exceeded those of teachers. The evolution of digital education will, in my view, be spectacular in the next period, in the sense that once such online programs are verified and online interaction are already present in the most university and even pre-university education around the world, digital education will be generalized and develop an independent study program exclusively online. In this context, it will be much easier for a student from Romania, Russia, and or the Republic of Moldova to access a top university in the United States, the United Kingdom, or France, as long as he knows the language. This will lead to an increase in competition between universities, leading in the medium and long term to the polarization of higher education among some of the top universities and the decline in interest in other regional universities. This will have to fight a real struggle for survival based on a research for a better position in the top of educational institution, much more fierce than at this time when the local characteristic of the university still matters in the selection of university to enroll. When students will have options to access online curricula of any of the world's major universities, doing so from home, the criteria for selecting study programs will be the most competitive price for the positioning of the university and its program studies in various rankings and the prestige that the university enjoys. We will be witnesses to disappearances of some university and certainly of some study programs in university, especially those in the technical, medical and real sciences. In the field of humanity, the local characteristic is particularly important, and one cannot claim to study, for example, Romanian literature at the Chinese university, or in France, or in the United States, at the same level at which he can be studied in Romania, even if in this respective university there are Romanian language departments and study program in Romanian. I believe that a more and more mixed education is being developed, which include both face-to-face and online training, amid the reduction of the number of hours face-to-face and the increase in the amount of allocated to online education or flip learning. In the same context, the publishing industry will experience a digitalization by increasing the volume of books and virtual publication against the background of the accentuation of the digital consumption of scientific or fiction literature. Also regarding the digitalization of education, we will be witnesses in the next period the emergence of artificial intelligence in education and the exponential growth of its role in education processes. AI-based education software that will have the ability to synthesize the information contents and to adapt them to the intellectual level and to the particular requirements of one or another of the students. Analyzing from an ethical point of view the transition to online and AI-based education, we cannot fail to mention the personalization of the educational relationship. It will be more and more difficult to build a master-disciple type relationship. Already this type of relationship being considered absolute in many academic environments. I believe that this relation will be increasingly deconstructed with an increasing emphasis on a student-client teacher-provider of training services. That is, a commercial, axiologically and emotionally neutral relationship. Teachers who do not adapt to the role transfer from the one of the trainee to who transmit information of a series of competency in which he is an expert, in the one of learning facilitator, in the person who transmits to the student how to learn and what is the technology. In order for them to cope with the virtual web of information, those teachers are likely to be increasingly marginalized in the world of education, which can be a professional drama for those teachers or even for the entire education system, as long as we witnesses the polarization of education between large education providers and local training providers, small or medium-sized, especially in the context of emergence of the digital teachers. Telework is also an activity that is currently undergoing extremely rapid virtualization, perhaps the fastest. Suddenly, many activities were outsourced that would never have happened in this pandemic had not occurred. Telework is also an activity that is currently undergoing extremely rapid virtualization, perhaps the fastest. Suddenly, many activities were outsourced that would never have happened if this pandemic time had not occurred. They probably would not have been virtualized and transformed into remote work, telework, many years ago, at least in our country, because virtualization eliminates a large part of the bureaucracy, diminishing the activity of those customers to signing papers. I believe that telework will continue in the next period because it worked efficiently with the onset of the pandemic period. Telework is much cheaper from the employer's perspective, with all the initial costs that equipment and technology entitle, especially since the most employees who currently perform telework have their own computer system, their own internet access, and so on. A disadvantage of teleactivity is that they are much more difficult to control remotely. Employees in the comfort of their own home can decrease the level of productivity of work, especially intellectual work. Effective business planning and bonus results will eliminate many of these inconveniences. I believe that in our country, after the cessation of the self-isolation measure, a large part of employees will return to office work because there were no regulations to facilitate telework during this period, and there were no concerns from development of telework solution for telework software solution for this activity. An advantage that this virtualization of professional activities has, whether we are talking about activity in health, education, public administration or economic areas, is that if it is possible to call a relocated specialist. A company in Frankfurt will be able to hire valuable specialists from Chisinau or Mozambique, which it can pay at a higher level than the salaries in the employee's country of residence. The relocation of professional activities already happened in multinational companies, in multinational corporations, as is in the case of those who provide call center activities, customer relations, IT services, PR activities, and so on. On the other hand, this increased relocation will lead to uninformatization of labor cost, implicitly to an economic growth of less developed area throughout this access to telework of the highly qualified resource, accentuating the brainstorming for the benefit of large corporations. On the other hand, for those considered indispensable for the activity of the organization, will continue the tendency to be brought to the headquarters or to the secondary office of the organization, precisely to retain the organization, because remote work does not generate or generates much less the feeling of collective identity of a company. Motivation policies based on team buildings or collective identity, on creating the professional identity correlated with the identity of an employing company, must be replaced with other such sources of motivation, but we find that there are no such short-term motivation program to address virtual employees. There are currently online trainings programs, but they are aimed at the employees who are working in the office and not employees relocated to the corporate headquarters, and this will probably be a direction for the development of educational service dedicated to the training of telemarketers. Next, we will approach an absolutely new level of virtualization of social space, namely the virtualization of religious activity and religious practice. There were, even before the pandemic crisis, that we are going through religious activity carried out throughout television or over the internet, such as those televangelism or even the live broadcasting of religious services. On the other hand, it was expected that in the religious sphere, the greatest resistance to virtualization will be encountered because, rightly, the representative of religious cults says the relationship with God, the relationship with the clergyman is a personal one, and that it is very difficult to maintain an apprenticeship relation with the clergyman by telephone or on the internet, and this does not replace direct confession before the clergyman. During the pandemic, in the Catholic world, the Pope granted the remission of sins to allow those involved in the fight against coronavirus, medical staff, social workers, patients, and so on, without the need for a confession of sins, a physical confession, making a gesture of virtual indulgence, transmitting through television and the internet, a gesture that can lay the foundation of a new spirituality that could be more and more present in our life, even if we are not aware of this reality now. The fact that the service were broadcast online and the habitus of participating in online religious services was created is likely to accentuate the tendency of some believers to have a personal but individual relationship in a home church with God. These habitats can lead in the long run to the population of church, and we hope not, to a resurgence of fanaticism and religious fundamentalism in a response to virtualization of religious practice. The frustration accumulated by those who have felt harmed by the inability to participate directly in religious activity can be directed toward fundamentalism. We hope that the representative of a religious activity, at least of those in our country, will find the wisdom to avoid the tendency of radicalization of some believers during the period of and immediately after the expiration of the state emergency. Rediscovering personal communication with God can be important for the spiritual because of believers in a post-pandemic period. The virtualization of religious interaction could be a trend, especially in the terms of catechesis and the activity of transmitting religious knowledge to more and more audience. There are already a large number of priests who broadcast virtual sermons or who broadcast online at certain times already yet on YouTube or Facebook channels, who address the faithful in general and not exclusively their own parishioners, and who have tens of thousands of followers on Facebook and YouTube. The virtual sermons will accentuate the virtualization of the religious phenomena, hopefully without greatly affecting the public participation in religious act. We say this especially in the condition in which during this period there was many who found that the religious services can generate spiritual experience and be heard on the internet or other media. In this context, the emphasis was on individual practice or personal asceticism, doubled by personal religious communion as much as possible, including through the media, considering that in the absence of personal communication with the clergyman and in general with the representative of the cult of which the persons are part, a major dimension of the religious feeling can be registered. The hypothetical virtualization of religious activity can develop in a positive sense, in the sense of the person's own spiritual search, or it can be evolved towards the institutional deconstruction of certain religious cults against the background of a possible doctrine eclecticism. Regarding the danger of religious radicalism, let's not forget that there is some religious cults which do not have a recognized activity in Romania. We are talking about Islamic groups, a practice already well established for recruiting believers through Facebook and alternative online programs, a method also used to recruit the members by Daesh and ISIS members in Europe. Against the background of the accelerating growth of the role of the virtual in the daily life of individuals, it is possible that certain advice blessing may continue to be offered online or by telephone, which would actually increase the interaction between the clergyman and the believer. As an opposite effect, a distancing of the so-called Easter and Christmas believers can be registered, that is, of those who do not attend a religious institution, a distancing, I was saying, precisely from these institutions. This exacerbated the phenomenon of secularization of public life, and despite the open possibility of online missionary work, we do not believe that fundamentally religious interaction will suffer greater virtualization than the transmission of service online or on specialized television stations. We said that this because officiating the ceremonial online precisely through the technological artifacts generated a feeling of distancing from the authentic spiritual and a feeling of secularization, a feeling that will eventually be rejected by religious communities. From the point of view of the evolution of bioethics, we expected the post-pandemic period an accentuation of the Christian bioethical discourse, religious in general, precisely in order to compensate the centripetal tendency in the relationship between the parishioners and the cult institutions. In this sense, we expect an emphasis on conservative tendency regarding traditional family institutions, the role of solidarity in the community, and the importance of the community in the lives of individuals. We expect an emphasis on religious firmnesses and defending the dogmatic unity of various denominations, especially some neo-Protestants who will want to make their voices even louder in this spiritual symphony that risks becoming global a noise of virtual religious interaction. These were the few tendencies of virtualization of the social space that I detached from the social phenomena as I received them during this period, doing a foresight exercise and without pretending to have exploited all the tendencies registered during this period or to have correctly intuited the direction in which the social phenomena related to the virtualization of the social space will evolve in post-pandemic period. Regarding the virtualization of social space, I am almost convinced that it will continue in the horizon of the next 10 or 20 years, when we will have most of the technology-mediated social interaction. The price the society will pay for this change in social interaction could be a decrease in emotional intensity of social interaction, especially interpersonal one, accompanied by the construction of the idea of a belonging group, because even within this group we already have and we will have more and more virtual relationship discussion with our children, parents, or grandparents via the internet, which is already happening in the case of families separated by migrations. The development of technology and habits created during this period, when virtualizing interaction with loved one were encouraged by the practice of self-isolation, will facilitate the amplified virtualization of relationship within the family environment and those of membership groups which will tend to be viewed more and more, increasingly disengaged at the level of some reference group. The notification of the loss of the quality of human interaction will be perceived after a while, when there will be a tendency to return to immediate relationship, as we currently have a tendency to return to nature and organic food after decades of failure. We have strived to build a food and food industry. We will also note the increasingly significant presence of artificial intelligence in our lives and discuss non-biological entities whose rights and obligations we will try to understand, building normative institutions to regulate how we will have to interact with this virtual otherness, this otherness that will often be non-present, although it will appear in the form of a material robot with which we can communicate. We have seen on the internet that already in Wuhan, in hospitals, there are such robots that treat patients and carry out care activities that are considered too dangerous to be performed by human staff. We have also seen such robots in a hospital in Bucharest. So we can conclude that they will soon be a daily presence. We are also used to communicating with unsubstantial biological entities, those communication bots of the giants in the IT industry, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and so on. And some of us are already communicating with the personal virtual assistant on our smartphone or computer. We will have more and more frequent interaction with non-biological entity which exist only in this augmented space, this extended space analog to hyperspace, and take from the science fiction literature a multidimensional space, noetic, but only partially imaginary, in which we are already immersed, and in which we are partially coexist. The virtualization of social space also implies the manifestation of a series of sociopathology as an effect of accessibility of communication and of its globalization. A first such effect is the fake news epidemic, or infodemia. The manipulation of information in the public space can be considered an aggression both against the persons received the information and towards political substantiality, national security, and public health. During the state of emergency, the Romanian government decided to derogate from respect the human rights, including suppressing freedom of expression when news presenting from a certain public source is considered to be a danger to public health by broadcasting false information. Organizations advocating for human rights, including the Romanian People's Advocate, have already expressed serious reservation about this practice of limiting freedom of expression in the name of public health as part of public interest. Restricting freedom of expression becomes ethically worrying when practiced by the IT giants such Facebook, YouTube, which practically control the information and influence the direction in which the virtualization of social space evolves. Recently, Facebook made the decision to censor posts calling the protest against self-isolation measure. This decision is all the more alarming from ethical perspective, the more its political connotation can be seen. Donald Trump is a supporter of anti-quarantine protesters, and censorship of information about this anti-quarantine social movement can be interpreted as anti-Trump political partnership. The ethical perspective on the conflict of value between the right to freedom of expression and the need for public protection against threats posed by infodemia to coronavirus should take into account the principle of proportionality of freedoms and rights restricted by the danger posed by censored communication and their potential social impact. When possible political attitudes are hidden under the imperialism of public health, this limitation of information, even with potential harmful one, can be seen as political partnership hidden behind the public interest. It is true that the sites in question are the property of private company, and that is the rule of using of the accounts of these sites users transfer to ownership of the content of the post to these sites, which give them the right to refuse publication. On the other hand, restricting freedom of information, including from alternative sources to official one, is dangerous for the quality of democracy in the country and even around the world in the case of internet giants mentions. The information's monopoly and partnership is all the most harmful as there are controversy in the public space not yet fully elucidated and which require the presentation of all points of view in order for the internet user to form his own informed opinion. In this regard, we mentioned the divergence of evidence-based opinion regarding the natural or artificial origin of the COVID-19 viruses. Opinions about the natural origin are supposed to be scientific evidence, while opinion about its artificial nature seems to be supported by evidence obtained by the information community, international intelligence community. Another pathology of communication that we are identifying at this moment is the increasing dependence of the internet among the population. Sociopathology related to the large number of hours spent on the internet can degenerate into addiction that can be integrated in the field of psychopathology. The quarantine period, which restricts the possibility of physical entertainment, banning team sports, closing theaters, cinemas, museums, libraries, and most bookshops, forced the public in search of entertainment or culture to use the resource available online. Theaters, opera, and other cultural institutions have recently broadcast online, including live. There was a rich offer from virtual visiting museums, bookstores, and even publishing houses have also facilitated free online book access. However, the transfer to virtual has meant an exponential increase in virtual entertainment, online games, but also video games, small prolonged discussions on social platforms, often transformed into virtual debates. All this creates an accentuated dependence on the internet. We cannot ignore the fact that with the compulsory nature of online education and especially with the approach of this online assessment period in pre-university and higher education message have begun to appear regarding the lack of IT resource or access to the internet and about the poverty pandemic in Romania but also worldwide, generally ignored by policymakers. We are talking about two Romanians, one who has access in general to health resources, to source of income, to culture, to social and public action, and especially to the internet, and one who does not have access to any of them, but who many decision makers rush to export it in the form of asparagus speakers or to hide in through ridiculous and unsystematical social protection measures. Continuing the previous presentation on the virtualization of social space, we will address the topic of fake news, which represent a real threat to society and could be considered a public health issue. The fake news campaign that accompanied public communication during the pandemic was named by OMS Infodemia, considering that its purpose was to generate panic and create social and economic problems which would seriously overcome the initial public health problem, namely that of the pandemic, to destabilize both the state and the global alliances. From an ethical point of view, we must notice the negative impact of infodemia both on public health and on humanity in general. This can lead to deviations from democracy and human rights, and ultimately to the dehumanization of society through the emphasis on social anxiety and the exacerbation of social desocializing fear, which accentuates social distancing far beyond the limit of physical distancing necessary to combat the pandemic. Among the many texts that address the issue of infodemia during this period, we have chosen to discuss a text from Daily News authored by Kaplan and Kenneth Mock entitled Speculation in the Absence of Data That Can Be Deadly. That was published on April 28, 2020. The article talks about speculation in the absence of data which can be fatal. The authors refrain from treating the issue of infodemia from the perspective of intentional fake news, which aims to mislead the population. Rather, they deal with involuntary fake news, which occurs as a result of violating the ethics of publication out of the desire of some authors to stand out by being the first to publish information considered scientific but which is not properly verified. Adhere to the ethic of publishing and communication of science require a clear distancing to be made between scientific results based on empirical data, field or laboratory, and personal opinion based on incomplete results or simple assumptions. The desire to be an opinion leader, to be an influencer, is growing, especially since the problem of pandemic concerns most of the planet's inhabitants. What is more, many people who are active in the public space do not resist the temptation to justify their position as opinion leader using predictions or asserting their points of view as a scientific one, although it is not supported by certain data or by accurate information, making assumptions launched in the public space and influencing others insofar as quite a large number of people express confidence in those influences. We are talking here about influential people, whether they are from political, organizational, professional, educational, scientific, or business environment. The authors quote above show that there are many people who want to take advantage of such moments with maximum psychological loads to carry out an online PR campaign, personal brand promotion, and strengthen their potential image. They bring up the topic of the coronavirus and the pandemic without taking into account the real information, which they often cannot understand due to the lack of competency in the field, being medical or public health, and without having concrete information about the evolution of the state of affairs and the pandemic. Thus, they modify the real information and present it either truncated or completely taken out of context, so as to support their own points of view. One such example is the situation of the Italian priest who is said to have donated the artificial respiration device to a young man to give him an extra chance to live. This information was ultimately proved false, because at the time of the priest's death, the device in question was not yet in the possession of the priest. The mere intention of the priest, if he had expressed it, could not have been considered a news story by the journalist that would produce enough emotional impact, and, as such, the information was improved. The temptation to present fake news, but with a wide psychological impact instead of certain data, but a lesser impact, comes from the desire to increase the audience. This, of course, respects journalistic ethics, turning readers into a means of increasing the profits of mass organization media or even blogs, and not for the purpose of journalistic activity as the Kantian categorical imperative would require. False information covered many aspects of pandemic, from possible therapy, including naturopathy, which are not necessarily tested or being tested in China, for example. Traditional remedies are being tested to the number of people infected, of deaths, and so on. It is particularly important that the situation is presented as realistically and concretely as possible, at least the information provided by officials, which is the most credible, although even among officials there are changes in the view and public policy, such as the case of Great Britain, which initially adopted a health policy based on obtaining herd immunity and following the alarmingly high increase in number of infection, returned and adopted the same policy as in other countries, namely voluntary self-isolation, social distancing, and so on. The article, quote from Daily News, shows that at this point health policy and therapeutic plan are based on partial research and even on articles proven to be unscientific. Approval for the emergency use of the already infamous hydroxychloroquine therapy was based on such articles. Those articles are not based on scientific tests on the use of this substance in coronavirus therapy, but on tests validating this substance for human use, which allows its pharmaceutical distribution. Regarding the therapeutic use of hydroxychloroquine, in coronavirus infection, it was based on the article by the French doctor Didier Raoul, which was based on the approval he already had for other disease. The substance has enjoyed huge popularity due its recommendation by the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, at a time when there was no significantly accepted remedy for this disease. The fact that this substance has been clinically tested and is not dangerous for human use, combined with the need to reduce public pressure on medical system due to the lack of treatment, has caused the entire medical community, or much of it, to rely to the opinion of the President of the United States and to accept hydroxychloroquine treatment on the basis of preliminary study and not irrefutable scientific evidence. This type of public communication can be interpreted as fake news if the idea of scientific validation of the therapy has been generalized in the media and not of sample assumptions formulated by experts based on partial evidence. From an ethical point of view, we wonder if the launch of incomplete information in the public space can be accepted in order to limit public pressure on the health system and reduce public anxiety in the face of a major epidemic to which humanity has no answer other than total withdrawal and social distancing. As for the development of new therapies and new vaccines, they start from existing data from the identification of active molecules, but it takes time to move from theoretical research on active substances to clinical trials, first on animals, then humans. Clinical trials are lengthy. If we remember, at the beginning of the period of self-isolation, we heard more and more frequent message about the start of clinical trial on new vaccines and new therapies, news that we continue to hear in the media even now. At the beginning of the pandemic, most news promised vaccine in 2 or 3 months. Subsequently, the appearance of a life-saving vaccines was postponed for the fall, then for the next year, and now there are rumors that a possible vaccine could be ready in about 3 years. The development of a vaccine requires a number of steps, from testing the substance to testing on human subjects, which cannot be done immediately after the active substance has been identified, unless it is already accepted for human use, and the new tests aim at the effectiveness in the face of new pathogen substances. In the case of new molecules, their faster testing on human subjects, even volunteers, means making them face additional risk in the context of which the active molecule itself can produce harmful side effects. In addition, testing a vaccine on humans involves the voluntary infection of people who are not infected with the virus, based on the assumptions about the vaccine's effectiveness in building immunity. The assumptions must first be tested on cells cultures and then on animals. Those inevitably take for longer than 2 months initially promised for the vaccine. Acceptance of vaccines on the market in the first month after the appearance of a new pathogen would mean a serious derogation from bioethical principle, a crisis of bioethics without precedent and with particularly serious long-term effects, as it would open the way to pseudo-scientific abuses in unconscionable medical experiments. On the other hand, we are talking about the very deadly effects on fake news because we need to balance the public anxiety and depression that can be caused by the news that we will not have a vaccine. Communicating the scientific reality in terms that the population who is largely unfamiliar with the scientific language can understand is, in our opinion, the best solution as opposite to issuing pseudo-scientific opinion by formulating with the weight of alleged expertise in the field. Unfortunately, the opinion is a national sport, which is more and more global, in which even outstanding specialists are involved with exceptional achievements in the field by associating their speech with a topic of the greatest interest. This is a matter of ethics, that if we all have the right to express our opinions, which is related to freedom of expression, but we must distinguish between our own opinion and our scientific knowledge. Personally, when I present certain aspects of a philosophical and not a scientific nature, I always introduce the idea by the phrase, in our opinion, or my point is that. This emphasizes that it is an opinion to which I may or may not have good reason to agree. However, it remains a personal opinion, which may have some factual justification, but it is not an universally valid scientific truth. Speaking of evidence-based practice, it also includes our own professional experience, but we must maintain a critical attitude toward knowledge. That is, treat our own practice with the Popperian demands that circumscribe scientific knowledge. In the absence of such practice, we may have opinions that are partially justified, that we can believe in and that we can express. However, there must be some degree of uncertainty about scientific knowledge, and ideally this should be expressed publicly when you address yourself as a public person, as a person who has a certain influence on professional, scientific, or student community, and so on. This is even more important as you act as an expert and the information you express may generate public policies or decisions, such as the adoption of hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir therapy, and so on. Michel Foucault, in 1990, points out the scientific discourse is a discourse of power, but it is not the only discourse that matters in the global course of opinion, which ultimately seeks to reach a consensus. Any researcher would like his own opinions to be influential and to be included in the global dialogue in a position that allows him to present a court of social construction of reality for as many people as possible. Unfortunately, the experience of dialogue turns into one of simultaneous monologues in which everyone speaks but no one listens. Opinions are as such important and worth expressing when there is a chance for validating them on the basis of Popperian science, or more often a simple interpretative agreement with the other members of the community you belong to, as unfortunately happens in many areas, especially in politics. However, there are situations in which decisions must be made much faster than the time we have for scientific studies. This is now the case regarding public policy decisions related to the closure of economic activities in order to achieve a certain protection of citizens from the current pandemic through distancing, through self-isolation, and so on. This decision cannot be based on experiments because it is neither the time for random clinical experiments nor it's ethically acceptable to conduct experiments on large population of people who have not given or would not normally give their consent to be subjects of a large-scale social experiments. Public policy in this period, however, have a pronounced experimental characters, at least as long as we are told that decisions are made depending on the evolution of events and society response to them. The trial and error test is a privileged model of experimentation in psychology, include mass psychology. This test targets discovery behavior and has generally been applied to guinea pigs by behavioral psychologists. The same trial and error model is attempted to be implemented in machine learning by artificial intelligence. The same quasi-experimental character is experienced by the public policy decision from the pandemic period, which aimed at balancing the threats to public health with those that appear for the sustainable development of the economy and the social environment. Let's hope that this experimental character of approaching the crisis does not have an experimental design, as some voices already claim. In fact, pandemics in human history have been analyzed from the perspective of the major changes they have brought in the evolution of humanity, in people's lifestyles and quality of life. A particularly interesting study published by Laura Spinney in Nature on the history of pandemics and their influence on social evolution seems to foreshadow this moment of anthropological singularity generated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which, at least for a while, has radically changed the concept of social, shifting from proximity to distance and from real to virtual. Timothy Caulfield, also in an article in Nature, but published much more recently in April 27, 2020, entitled "We Are Already Tired on Pseudoscience and COVID-19," touch on the problem of unscientific treatments such as cow urine, cocaine and herbal mixture, some of which have no side effects, treatments that do not produce proven effect in the case of coronavirus, or produce side effects that worsen health. Also, in the category of pseudoscience are the so-called expert approaches that are related to conspiracy theory, such as the presentation of infection as a biological weapon, the impact of 5G technology on the spread of coronavirus, the transmission of nanobots throughout vaccination against COVID-19, and so on. All these accounts are so-called gurus of alternative medicine who promote various substances, pills, and practice that improve the immune system, constitute pseudosciences, which does not necessarily mean that they are false and cannot have positive results on some occasions, but only then they are untested, and the possibility results may be completely random. However, it can also mean that we do not know the possible side effect, which could sometimes be particularly serious, especially when, due to the belief in alternative therapy and theories, the patient refuses or is denied significantly validated therapy by their relatives. As a scientifically validated therapy does not yet exist for COVID-19, official medicine has a symptomatic approach, trying viable therapies that are not scientifically tested or scientifically enough tested, but are known not to cause harm. For a bioethical point of view, the symptomatic treatment with drugs that are considered to be good respond to the imperative not to leave the patient without treatment, but they are not very far from the limits of the pseudoscientific or unsystematic nature of therapy. A number of herbal therapies, such as herbal medicine, acupuncture, or homeopathy, could, for example, improve the body's overall immunity, which cannot be beneficial in some situations, including patients with COVID-19. Stimulating the body's immune response can lead to an improvement in the immune response of people who resort to such remedies, and possibly mild or asymptomatic forms of the disease when they become infected. This, however, cannot be attributed exclusively to alternative therapy, although its influence cannot be completely ruled out. Much more serious from the health point of view are those completely harmful treatments that produce aggressive or the health conditions, being thus discredited in any forms of natural therapy. But also allopathic scientific medicine. This is because at the level of public opinion, it puts emphasis on the emotional factor reported by the number of deaths and infections, and not on the associated comorbidities, which in many cases cause the death even in the coronavirus infection hastened it. As such, the use of pseudoscientific therapy when they produce negative effects such as aggravating the suffering is a factor that can contribute to mortality. However, this mortality is attributed to a failure of scientific medicine, often ignoring the effect of pseudoscientific practice. However, it is the person's right to follow such as natural therapies, especially when science does not offer them any solution and when their life and health are in great danger. When, for example, medical science tells them that they have a number of months left to live, and that the person chooses to help or fate or some practices of phytotherapy, natural therapy, yogis, shamans, which in certain situations have been presented as true or false, as being able to contribute to healing or prolonging life. We are talking here about the right to hope, which should be granted to the patient only in conjunction with the right to be informed about their medical condition or to refuse to know. Another article that we want to bring into the discussion is the one that was published in the website caleaeuropeană.ro, European Way.ro website, according to which the United Nations call on countries to respect human rights in order to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe whose effect would far outweigh the pandemic itself. I was saying that there are a number of articles that contain pseudoscientific messages, including those that convey messages concerning conspiracy theory, and that may even endanger public health. Authorities in various states have proposed, and this has been done, the restriction of some websites that transmit such message, this being particularly a limitation of the right to expression. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights called on countries to respect the rule of law and not to take advantage of the coronavirus pandemic, including the time limitation of exceptional measure. Along with freedom of expression, other rights and freedoms are harmed and, as the quoted article tells us, harming such rights can cause incalculable damage to efforts to combat the pandemic and its socio-economical side effects. The United Nations expressed concern that the measures and rules introduced in the states refer to vaguely defined crimes sometimes associated with severe punishments, fueling fears, and they could be used to silence the media and criticism and to arrest opponents. If he previously expressed the fact that it is unethical to present our own opinions as universal truths, it is just as ethical for states to limit the rights to expression, effectively censoring publications that present an alternative to official opinions. There are likely to be ongoing misinformation campaigns promoted by various states interested in destabilizing other states, which is what we already call hybrid warfare, being based on destabilizing messages for public safety. But the war against infodemia and fake news cannot be waged by increasing censorship, because once this tool of censorship is used, there will be a tendency to develop an undemocratic society which is no longer sensitive to the needs of citizens, but rather to the points of the view of the authorities and their needs. Furthermore, even if it is not a necessary totalitarian society, it will be at least a society in which authoritarian practice and regimes of governance are privileged. There is a risk for European society becoming even more permissive to authoritarian influences in politics than in the previous period. This is precisely because such authoritarian tendency already exists before the pandemic, and the need for public safety and public health has already led to a number of limitations of the freedom that citizens, even if they will not get used to them in the future, will accept them, considering them inevitable. Another example of freedom that has been restricted during the pandemic is religious freedom, when it has not been possible to participate in religious service even during the Easter holidays, now where practice related to common funeral rituals allowed. The restriction of religious freedom under the rules of public health may be justified for a certain period, but the extension of this has been turned into a violation of freedom as long as alternative solution can be found involving, for example, social distancing, so often invoked during this period. Maintaining very strict restraint measures after the cessation of the state of emergency of religious freedom and freedom of consciousness can be challenging for many people who emphasize those values. We continue by answering a question from a participant in our workshop, which states, wearing a mask in public space is justified by the fact that it limits the spread of the virus, but we still do not understand the role of that written statement that we are obliged to have on ourselves. What is your opinion? I believe that wearing a mask is welcome and can save lives if it is properly made in accordance with medical standards. There is a whole range of masks on the market that are useless in terms of COVID-19 protections requirements. Wearing a mask limits freedom of expression, and then the reasons for this decision must be explained as clearly as possible and how long it is estimated that this limitation will last. Wearing a mask is an intrusion of the state into private life, as long as we are required in the name of public health to wear an uniform. Wearing a mask becomes a significant social fact as long as it is a social gesture that we make in an institutionalized way. To be justified, the institutionalization of the anti-COVID uniform must convince that the benefits to both the personal and other, in terms of the number of victims of the infected avoided, outwit the inconvenience, including the fact that wearing a mask remained a symbol of social concealment and distancing, which will also mark the post-COVID period. A society that wearing masks will amplify the feeling of distrust of individuals in people in the immediate vicinity, even only because in the collective subconsciousness the idea of the mask is correlated with the idea of the villain, changing the social construct of a person wearing a mask from one who has something to hide, who hides their true identity, to the idea of a person who is responsible for others, protecting their health and protection themselves at the same time, could bring with it a series of interpretative adrifts correlated with the idea of social hiding and not hiding. There will also be interpretative adrift in the social construction of one's identity, as facial representation is a special element in the construction of self-image. Wearing a mask is also a barrier between the person and the environmental, and, as such, wearing it can be perceived positively or negatively, depending on the representation of the environment as a threat or as a comforting element, bringing satisfaction. A society that wears masks long-term can deviate toward an extremely individualistic society, which accentuates the distance through its perceived symbol, the mask, integrated in a collective subconsciousness. Social learning of a behavior, such as wearing a mask, can generate a deconstruction of freedom in the sense that a window of opportunity is generated, a return window, on the social acceptability of a restriction of liberty, the reason invoked being the public interest. In the fact, the current pandemic opens many windows of opportunity regarding the virtualization of social space, the deconstruction of social solidarity and social distancing, which replace sociability, the renunciation to freedom of expression, opinion, consciousness, and so on. The overtone window is a moment of opportunity for a public policy created in a context of process of obtaining consensus and, respectively, of an interpretative adrift of a public policy's aim. The restriction of civil liberties would have been absolutely unacceptable in a democratic state had it not been for the current epidemiological context, which have deconstructed the universality of individual claims to freedom in favor of public safety. The social acceptability of restriction of individual freedom and human rights open a window of opportunity for authoritarian practice that take place in special situations such as the state of emergency, and which may continue under the same public security needs after the end of the state of emergency and the decree for an alert status or any other political status. Far be it from us to deny the need to maintain restrictive measures even after the start of a gradual relaxation of self-isolation measures. However, the new measures can only be taken through public consultation and through normative instruments specific to parliamentary democracy. Derogation with respect for human rights should not be a window of opportunity for authoritarian public policy and a political distance from the obligation of decision-making transparency. Another political problem in the situation of an open overturned window is the dissolution of the European Union and the undermining of the process of European unification begun by turning for the conservative rights in some Eastern European states. That sends signal of political distancing from the EU and proximity to Russia following by the Brexit exercise, and now the finding of the US its inability to ensure the achievement of fundamental values such as freedom of movement in extreme contexts. Conservative political discourse, with reference to the identity of the EU and the need to return to the nation states, will capture the window of opportunity, emphasizing the political shift to the conservative right in the condition of closing the windows of acceptability of liberal European unification and progressive policies. This window of opportunity can be opened gradually throughout communicative action and the construction of an interpretative adrift in the sense of acceptability of a certain public policy. Hopefully, there is no overtone window agenda to hide behind the infodemia in terms of a global political construction and the relocation of the poles of power that is, by moving from a bipolar world during the Cold War or unipolar to the period of US hegemony in the international politics toward the period of multipolarism with state actors such as the United States, Russia and China, but also organizationals as in the case of the EU or NATO. We cannot fail to interpret in this case the windows of opportunity, the accusation brought by both the United States and by European countries to the OMS and the background of the current pandemic, that they would manipulate the data regarding its evolution. Joseph Overton speaks of a window of opportunity for public policy in the sense of opening them up to a social acceptability, but the process can also be viewed in the opposite direction in the sense of throwing away absolute value that once formed the basis of European society, for example, religious values, undermined by the policy of social distancing, the campaign of fake news, and the increased public hate against the background of generalized fears and poor communication situations in the crisis of some institutional actors. Returning to the question proposed by the participant in the virtual lecture regarding the statement on her own responsibility regarding the purpose, direction, and during of our trips outside the home, which we are currently obligated to have on us. This was introduced in Italy and probably before in China and Wuhan, having this statement with us meaning delimiting in time and space the interaction with others. Moreover, it limits my mobility not only in terms of space but also in terms of intention. Moreover, it obscures my right to change my mind. These limitations are again on account of the need for security, limiting social interaction, being a way to eliminate the possibility of infection. Maintaining these long-term limitations can lead to the internalization of the limits of external spatiality and the accentuation of the virtualization of social space as a refuge in transdimensional. Moreover, limiting long-term interaction with others by restricting travel distance and routes, as well as the non-random nature of spatial mobility, increases the degree of social rigidity and decreases the willingness of individuals to give up their communication intentions in order to socialize. Repeated awareness of intention leads to an increase in social pragmatism and a possible decrease in the playful nature of social interactions. When the military ordinance is in fact in a period of emergency, the justification of such measures on the basis of public health are legitimate, a certain constraint being necessary, including finance the sanctions errors in the declaration of one's own responsibility or even in its non-existence. The mere invocation of public health and disease prevention as the purpose of this limitation of certain rights and restrictions into a person's private life is not sufficiently to justify the violation of individuals' freedom. These measures must be explained and correlated with similar measures in other countries affected by the pandemic, at least with those in the European Union. If, for example, we talk about the United States, where there are already over 1 million people infected, we find that in many states there are already manifestations which are supported by the President of the United States on liberalizing restrictions and resuming economic activity, chosen because there are expectations about a major economic and social crisis. Compared to the situation in the US, the ones in Romania may appear to public opinion as much less serious, and as such, the more severe measures can be considered unjustified in the absence of adequate communication. This communication must be free of contradictions between the various public broadcasters, President, Prime Minister, Internal Minister, and so on. In conclusion, we will present another anecdote that circulated during this period and that states that we live in the periods of Schrodinger's virus. Schrodinger spoke of his famous cat, which, once put in a box and irradiated, could not be specified as either alive or dead until the box was opened. So now we've not been tested, do not know whatever or not we are infected. We are all being asked to behave as if we are infected, to protect others, and as if we are not infected and therefore have no immunity to protect ourselves. As such, we must act as if we are both infected and non-infected to protect ourselves and others at the same time.